Okay, so we did get up to, we did Aries, Taurus, we did Gemini, and we did Cancer, and then my phone ran out of battery. So we're gonna continue from Leo, hopefully all the way through to Pisces, and we're gonna find out who you were in your past life or past lives. I'm praying for another snow day, guys. I'm praying for a snow day because I got one day before yesterday. It's just really put everyone in the Christmas spirit. It's really nice. And we're allowed to have Christmas lights in school as long as they're battery ones. So, you know, got to celebrate the wins. There was a question over whether we could have Christmas lights up. So I checked with the health and safety officer. I'm a high school teacher, by the way. And said, yeah, if it's battery ones, no probs. Okay, got some Dragon's Breath Sage. Spirit guides, universe, and angels, please stand beside me and guide me for Leo's highest good. Who was Leo in a previous life? Okay, so, oh wow. In a previous life, Leo, you were a slave or a concubine. Okay, you identified as a child in Viking times. The lesson that you learned was accountability. Oh, it says you died of a broken heart. This all happened in Western Europe. The trauma you experienced was slander. Your faith was pantheistic or animistic. Animism is like in certain countries, because you're so at one with the environment, you believe in animals, don't you, rather than human gods. In a previous life, you've had health issues. Now that could have been infection. It could have been contagious illness, genetic illness, or hypochondria. Okay, so something surrounding illness. Anything else for Leo? If you just joined, we've already done Aries, Taurus, Gemini and Cancer, and then my phone ran out of battery, so I've just charged it up, and we're starting from Leo, going through to Pisces. Okay. Who was Leo in a past life, previous lives? Yeah. Okay. Several lives. Oh, that's cool. You could have been an athlete, like a Roman gladiator, a duelist, martial artist, or something else. Some other kind of sensational athlete. This was during the Neolithic Revolution. The lesson you learned was overcoming loss. You died by drowning. This took place in North America. The trauma you experienced was that of disaster. The faith that you had was magic-based. The love that you had was non-possessive, and you identified as an adult female. Wow, an adult female athlete, that's cool. Okay, in a previous life, you experienced some kind of destruction. You could have been the destroyer. You could have been a saboteur. You could have been a helpless maiden or a fool. You experienced a star-crossed love with another person. You identified as an older man. This was during the late Bronze Age. The lesson you learned was about seeing the bigger picture. You died at war. All of this took place in the Baltics or Central Europe. Your faith was primal or aboriginal. The trauma you experienced was physical or sexual abuse. Right, in a previous life, you could have been part of a secret society. You could have been a Freemason, a Rosicrucian, I'm going to have to look that up, Camorra, or other. I'm going to have to Google these things. Do you know what these are? You were part of an ascetic faith. You had a love that was obsessive. You identified as somebody's husband. The time frame was early modern age. The lesson that you learnt was in gluttony. You died from dementia. And this took place in Africa. Okay, the trauma you experienced was abandonment. In a previous life, Leo, you could have been a swindler. You could have been the perpetrator. You could have been exposed as a swindler or exposed a swindler. You could have evaded capture. And you could have swindled people out of their money. This was in Africa. The trauma you experienced was abandonment. You were part of an ascetic faith. The love that you had was obsessive. You identified as somebody's husband. This was during the early modern age. The lesson you learnt was gluttony, and death happened by dementia. Okay, in a previous life, Leo, you could have been intellectual, a philosopher, an inventor, a scientist, or a mathematician. You had a love affair. You were part of a mystical faith. You had a loss of status or reputation, and this was part of a trauma for you. The location was Oceania. You died from hypothermia. The lesson you learnt was to do with power. You identified as a grandparent. The time frame we're talking about is during the Crusades and the Inquisition. Wow, that's a lot of past lives. Leo, you've been busy. Okay, so on to Virgo. Spirit, who was Virgo in a previous life? Right, you could have been the victim of discrimination. Socially, religiously, sexually. You could have had some sort of limitation or disease. The time frame was the late Bronze Age. Your lesson that you learned was about seeing the bigger picture. You identified as an older man. You had a star-crossed love. Your faith was primal or aboriginal. Trigger warning here, okay. The trauma that you experienced was physical or sexual abuse. You died whilst at war. This was during the late Bronze Age. Okay, in a previous life, Virgo, you... You were a leader. You had some kind of leadership. You were a leader, a ruler, a boss, or a follower. The lesson you learned was about power. You died by hypothermia. This took place in Oceania. The trauma you experienced was a loss of status or reputation. Your faith was mystical. You had a love affair. And you were identified as a grandparent. The time frame of this was during the Crusades and the Inquisition. Okay, Virgo, in a previous life, you were part of some kind of air disaster. Okay, so that could have been a plane crash, a tornado, a bomb, or an asteroid hitting. The location where this happened was in the jungle. The trauma you experienced was having an accident or being part of an accident. Your faith was nature-based. You experienced a love that was very possessive. You were an adult male. This was during the early Stone Age. The lesson you learnt was hubris. Okay, so that's excessive ego and pride. Gets you into trouble. Okay, that's hubris. You died by animal attack. Wow. Okay, so moving on to Libra. Right, who was Libra in a previous life? Okay, in a previous life, you were engaged in obsession. Obsessive love, jealousy, an obsessive lover, or something else, something to do with obsession. This was during the late Middle Ages. You identified as a father. The love you experienced was LGBT. Okay, so lesbian, gay, bisexual or trans. You had a faith that was very secret. You kept it secret from people. This took place in India. You died of old age and the lesson you learnt was peace. Okay. The time frame of this was the late Middle Ages. Some kind of obsessive love. Okay, Libra, in a previous life, you were a psychic. You could have been a high priestess, a gypsy, a prophet, or an astrologer. Okay, in a previous life, you're some kind of psychic. You identified as a mother. The time frame was the Age of Enlightenment. See, that's on discovery of science, wasn't it? In medieval times. The lesson you learnt was about truth and discernment. You died by poisoning. The location of this was the Arctic or Antarctic, so I would say Arctic because people don't live in the Antarctic. It's not possible, it's minus 90 degrees. The trauma you experienced was war. You were part of a sacrificial faith. The love you experienced was polyamorous or polygamous. Let's get you one more. Libra, in a previous life, you were experiencing a romance. It was true love, star-crossed love, unrequited love, or a love of convenience. Your faith was a cult, okay? Your love was companionship. Your identity was you were somebody's friend. The time frame was during the American Civil War era. The lesson you learnt was about passive conformity. You experienced death by torture. And the location of this was an underground civilization. Trigger warning. The trauma you experienced was psychological or verbal abuse. Okay, so moving on from Libra to Scorpio. Let's get some cards for Scorpio. Who was Scorpio in a previous life? And we can have many lives, okay? Addiction. Somebody who experienced addiction. You could have been a functioning addict, a caretaker. You could have hit rock bottom. You could have been someone that enabled another person who had addiction, okay? In some capacity, you experienced addiction. The lesson that you learned was to do with self-love. You died in old age. Your location was the stars. The trauma you experienced was a psychic wounding. Your faith was celestial. You experienced true love. You identified as androgynous. The time frame of this was pre-Earth. Let's get another one for Scorpio. Okay, some kind of water disaster. There was some kind of water disaster. You may have drowned. You could have experienced being part of a flood, a tsunami or tropical storm. You could have been lost at sea. You became a spinster, okay? You had a lover. This happened during the World War. Your lesson was becoming more natural. Unfortunately, trigger warning here, okay? You died by miscarriage or at birth. The location of this was the lost civilization. Your trauma was oppression. Your faith was fanatical. One more for Scorpio, please. In a previous life, Scorpio, you could have been a wisdom keeper, okay? Someone very wise, someone very well informed, a wounded healer, somebody very enlightened. You became a spinster. You had a lover. This happened during the World War. Your lesson was becoming more natural. You could have miscarried or died at birth. You were part of a lost civilization. The trauma you experienced was oppression. And the final one, in a previous life, Scorpio, you were saintly. You could have been a philanthropist, a caretaker, a martyr, or a saviour or hero. Trigger warning, the trauma you experienced was psychological or verbal abuse. You were part of a cult, that was your faith. The love you experienced was about companionship more than anything. You identified as somebody's friend. The time frame of this was the American Civil War. The lesson you learnt was about passive conformity. You died by torture. Okay, moving on then from Scorpio to Sagittarius. I want a bit more sage. Why is that not lighting? That's weird, isn't it? Why is that candle not lighting? I want my sage to burn. That's better. Okay, Sagittarius. Right, in a previous life, who was Sagittarius? Sagittarius, in a previous life, you had major accomplishment. You could have been a high achiever, a competitor, a celebrity. You could have experienced failure, okay? The time frame of this was pre-Earth. Your lesson that you learned was about self-love. You died at old age. Your location was the stars. The trauma was psychic wounding. Your faith was celestial. You experienced true love, and you identified as androgynous. Okay. Right, I am going to do a trigger warning. If you don't want to discuss topics that are uncomfortable, I wouldn't watch this, okay? This is to do with childhood trauma. Sagittarius, in a previous life, you could have been kidnapped or sold. You could have been abused somehow, abandoned or orphaned. This was during the early Bronze Age. You were a young female. You experienced love that was unrequited. You could have, it says your trauma was imprisonment. Okay, this happened in Mexico. You died by a non-contagious illness. The lesson that you learnt was in self-identity. Let's get one more for Sagittarius. Right, so it's to do with murder, this one. So Sagittarius, you could have been murdered. You could have committed suicide. You could have been witness to a murder. You could have been a murderer. Right. This was out in Asia. Your faith was one where you experienced forced conversion. The trauma you experienced was a guilty conscience. You died by starvation or dehydration. The lesson you learned was about prophecy and gifts. The time frame was pre-Columbian Americas. You were identified as somebody's grandchild. In love, you were deceived or betrayed. Okay, so that was Sagittarius. Moving on to Capricorn. Spirit, who was Capricorn in a previous life? Oh wow, you could have been someone who experienced insanity, okay? Maybe delusions, hallucinations, hysteria, or mania. Your trauma was poverty. You died by murder. The lesson that you learned was to do with greed. You identified as a devotee or follower. You were part of an ethical religion. The location was Eastern Europe. You experienced abandonment. Okay, Capricorn. In a previous life, you could have been someone who was wealthy. You may have inherited money. You may have acquired money. You could have been someone that was gambling or had speculation over money. You could have been a miser, someone who was mean with money. The trauma you experienced was oppression. You were part of a fanatical faith. You became a spinster. You had a lover. The time frame was during the World War. Your lesson was in becoming more natural. You died during miscarriage or at birth. This happened in a lost civilization. Okay. In a previous life, it's talking about current lifetime. I didn't really understand that. It says gestation period, childhood, teenage years, or adulthood. Something about this current lifetime. I don't know, I don't get that. You identified as an older woman who experienced an arranged marriage. Your faith was esoteric. The trauma that you experienced was being exiled. This happened in Central or South America. You died by natural disaster. The lesson that you learned was in self-expression. Okay, this was during the Middle Bronze Age. I don't understand how that goes with current lifetime. Don't really get that. In a previous life, Capricorn, you experienced torture, whether you were the victim, the informer, the torturer, or a witness to torture. You were very philosophical in your faith. You identified as a widow or widower. Yeah, you were somebody's wife, but you became widowed. This was during the late modern age. Your lesson that you learned was about walking the middle path. You died at childbirth. Okay, and this played out in the Middle East. The trauma you experienced was material loss. Okay, Capricorn. In a previous life, you had some sort of experience with power. So you could have been in a position of authority. Somebody who experienced much fame or recognition. There could have been an abuse of power or a loss of power. Okay, something to do with power. You were a mother. You were part of a sacrificial faith. Your trauma was that you experienced war. This was during the Age of Enlightenment. Okay, so when we discovered science. The lesson that you learned was about truth and discernment. You died by poisoning. It says location, Arctic or Antarctic, but you can't live in the Antarctic, it's minus 90 degrees. So it must have been the Arctic. The love that you experienced was polyamorous or polygamous. Okay, Capricorn, in a previous life you experienced war. You could have been a warrior. You could have been conscripted for war. You could have been a deserter. Or you could have experienced trauma from war. Your faith was very philosophical. This was out in the Middle East during the late modern age. You were somebody's wife. You became a widow or widower. The trauma you experienced was material loss. You died at childbirth. The lesson that you learnt was in walking the middle path. Right, Capricorn, in a previous life, you experienced the loss of a loved one. Okay, so you could have experienced death, abandonment. There may have been an unexplained disappearance, or there could have been death due to war. Your faith was in a mystical faith, okay? You had a love affair. You became a grandparent. The time frame was during the Crusades and the Inquisition. The lesson that you learnt was to do with power. You experienced death by hypothermia. The location was in Oceania. The trauma that you experienced was a loss of status or reputation. Okay, moving on then from Capricorn to Aquarius. Okay, who was Aquarius in a previous life? I mean, we have many lives, so... You were somebody that enjoyed nature worship. So you could have been into pantheism, Druidism, Franciscan mysticism, or animism. You were a grandchild. Unfortunately, in love, you were deceived or betrayed. In your faith, you were forced to convert, okay? There was a forced conversion of faith. The trauma you experienced was a guilty conscience. You died by starvation or dehydration. The time frame of this was pre-Columbian Americas. Another one for Aquarius, please. Who was Aquarius in a previous life? Oops. Okay, you could have been someone who had food issues, okay? So someone who was gluttonous, someone who preferred vegetarianism, someone who had a relationship with food that involved fasting or deprivation, someone who had nutritional or food issues. Your faith was primal or aboriginal. You were star-crossed lovers with another. You were an older man. This was during the late Bronze Age. Your lesson was in seeing the bigger picture. You died at war. This happened in the Baltics or Central Europe. I'm going to do a trigger warning, guys, to do with what you experienced, some kind of trauma. It was physical or sexual abuse. Let's get another one for Aquarius. In a previous life, you could have been ascetic, okay? So you could have been a Buddhist, you could have been Christian, you could have been a hermit or a mystic. The trauma you experienced was disaster, and this was in North America. You died by drowning. The lesson that you learned was overcoming loss. You were an adult female. You were part of a non-possessive love. Your faith was magic-based. Okay, so some sort of ascetic, religious person. Let's get you one more. That's loads. Aquarius, in a previous life, you could have been involved in some sort of earth disaster, so a building collapse, an earthquake, an animal attack, or a drought, some sort of natural disaster on earth. You were a sibling. You may have experienced domestic abuse. You were agnostic or atheist faith. Your trauma was that you had some sort of physical limitation. This happened in Northern Europe. You died by fire. Your lesson was in leadership. This was during the classical antiquities period. Okay. In a previous life, Aquarius, you had a relationship with animals as a herder, an animal lover, someone involved in the care of animals, or something else. Animals were very important. This was during the early Stone Age. You were an adult male. Your faith was nature-based. You were out in the jungle. The trauma you experienced was some kind of accident. You died by animal attack. The lesson that you learned was to do with hubris, okay, excessive pride and ego. You had a love that was very possessive of you. It's an interesting one, that one, isn't it? Okay, in a previous life, imprisonment, there was some kind of imprisonment, okay? So you could have been imprisoned, you could have been freed, you could have been the imprisoner, the one locking people up, or you could have escaped prison in a previous life. This happened out in Western Europe. Oh, you died of a broken heart. The lesson that you learned was in accountability. The time frame was during the Viking Age. You were a child, you were a slave or a concubine. The faith that you had was pantheistic or animistic. The trauma that you experienced was slander against your name. Aquarius, in a previous life, there was something to do with children, okay? Fertility, loss, infertility, or illegitimacy. So children outside of wedlock. This was out in Mexico. Your faith was monotheistic. Your trauma was imprisonment. You died by non-contagious illness. The lesson you learnt was in self-identity. It was during the early Bronze Age, and you were a young female. The love you experienced was unrequited. Okay. Okay, in a previous life, you could have been very much involved with charity. You could have been a benefactor, so someone who contributes to a charity, a patron, a beneficiary, or a good Samaritan. You identified as a young female. You experienced unrequited love. Your faith was monotheistic. You experienced trauma. This was out in Mexico. You died of a non-contagious illness. The lesson that you learned was in self-identity. And this was during the early Bronze Age. Okay, in a previous life, you could have been rural living. So you could have been a peasant, a farmer, a woodsman, or a hunter. You were a good friend to somebody. The love you experienced was companionship. You were part of a cult. You experienced a trauma that involved psychological or verbal abuse. You were part of an underground civilization. You died by torture. The lesson you learnt was in passive conformity. This was during the American Civil War. Okay, so in a previous life, Aquarius, you could have had something to do with brainwashing. So you could have been someone who experienced political brainwashing, religious brainwashing, social brainwashing, or some other experience of brainwashing. You were polytheistic in faith. The trauma you experienced was in persecution or torture. You died by accident. The lesson that you learnt was abuse of technology. The time frame was the age of Atlantis. In love, you were celibate or asexual. Where this happened was on an island location. Okay. Aquarius, in a previous life, you could have had an alternative sexuality, okay? You could have been part of a sexual minority. You could have been a Casanova. You could have been asexual, or polygamist, or polyamorous. Your faith was nature-based. You had a very possessive kind of love. You were an adult male in the early Stone Age. The lesson you learnt was in hubris, excessive pride and ego. You died by animal attack in the jungle. The trauma you experienced was accident. Okay, moving on from Aquarius to Pisces. Okay, spirit in a previous life, who was Pisces? Right, Pisces, in a previous life, there was some kind of disaster surrounding ice. So it could have been during the Ice Age, during a blizzard. You could have experienced hypothermia, or it could have been during hail. You were a child who became a slave or concubine. The trauma you experienced was slander against your name. Your faith was pantheistic or animistic. The lesson you learnt was in taking accountability. It was during the Viking Age. Have I missed anything? No. It's in Western Europe. Another one for Pisces, please. Okay, in a previous life, Pisces, you could have been involved with royalty. You could have been a direct descendant of royals. You could have been an illegitimate royal. You could have been distantly related to royals, or deposed or lost a title that was royal. You were part of a cult faith during the American Civil War. The lesson that you learnt was in passive conformity. You died by torture in an underground civilization. The trauma you experienced was psychological or verbal abuse. And the love you experienced was centered around companionship. You identified as somebody's friend. Okay, really, really good friend. Let's get another one for you, Pisces. Whoops. Right, in a previous life, you were involved in the fall of a civilization. So greed was involved, corruption, indulgence, or ignorance. This was during the early Middle Ages. You were a guru or an idol. You had a love, but you were separated by distance. Your faith was Gnostic or dualistic. You experienced a trauma and it was some kind of mental illness. You died by suicide. The lesson that you learnt was in forgiveness. Okay, let's get one more for Pisces. And then we will leave it there. Okay, in a previous life, you were a truth seeker. So you could have been someone who conducts investigations, someone who was a spy, someone who questioned authority, or you could have been someone who questioned spirituality, okay? A really deep thinker. This was during the late modern age. You were somebody's wife. You became a widow or widower. You were part of a philosophical faith. The trauma you experienced was a material loss. This was out in the Middle East. The lesson you learnt was in walking the middle path. During the late modern age. All right, that concludes who were you in a previous life. Okay, I will let the reading, it has to process after I close a live. It does something called processing. So I think maybe tomorrow night I'll be able to put timestamps. Okay. All right, take care, Pisces, or whoever's watching, and I will see you in the next one.